Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you yet again for joining us for this daily update. As usual, I will start with an update on some of the key statistics about the spread and impact of COVID-19 in Scotland. As at 9 o'clock this morning, I can report that there have been 8,672 positive cases confirmed, which is an increase of 222 since yesterday. A total of 1,866 patients are currently in hospital with either confirmed or suspected COVID-19. That is an increase of 57 from yesterday. And a total of 166 people last night were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected COVID-19. That's a decrease of 3 since the figure I reported to you yesterday. Now, while I would still urge caution in interpreting these figures, I do remain cautiously optimistic that, firstly, while the numbers being admitted to hospital are still fluctuating on a daily basis, they do appear to be broadly stable. And secondly, the numbers being admitted to intensive care are at this stage reducing. And we shouldn't forget how important that is. It's not too long ago that we were seriously worried about the potential for our hospital capacity to be overwhelmed by now. The fact that it is not is down to the planning that's been done in the National Health Service, of course, but more than that, it is down to the high compliance with the lockdown restrictions. So my thanks to all of you for helping us to ensure that the NHS has been able to cope, although the work that they do is very difficult and very challenging. It is, of course, in the nature of the virus that there will be a lag between numbers being admitted to hospital and intensive care reducing and the numbers sadly dying from this virus reducing. But I hope we will see the latter number also start to reduce in the next couple of weeks. However, in the last 24 hours, I am afraid that 70 deaths have been registered of patients who have been confirmed as having COVID-19. That takes the total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement to 985. I would remind you, however, that registration over weekends, and this is a point you have heard me make often before, registrations over weekends still tends to be lower than during the week, so today's higher figure will, at least in part, be a reflection of that. I would also remind you that these daily figures are of people who have sadly died after testing positive for this virus. Tomorrow, National Records of Scotland will again publish its weekly report, which will show the number of people who have died with either presumed or suspected COVID-19, as well as those who have had a positive test confirmed. And again, as I always do, because it is really important always to do this, I want to stress that each of these deaths represents much, much more than a statistic. They each represent an individual who was loved by family and friends and whose loss is a source of intense grief. And so, again, I want to extend my sincere and deepest condolences to everyone who has lost a loved one. I also want again to thank all of our health and care workers. The entire country continues to be grateful to you for the extraordinary work that you're doing. And it's worth also making the point that there are not just health and care workers, although we understand the importance of the work they are doing. There are essential workers across a range of areas who are going to work every day right now to keep the country moving, to keep the country going, to keep food on the table and to keep the lights on. And to each and every one of them, let me say thank you as well. Now, I've got 3 issues I want to speak briefly about today. The first is that the government's chief economist, Gary Gillespie, published the latest State of the Economy report this morning. Gary is here with us today, and we'll see a bit more about that in a few minutes. But this report confirms the fact that dealing with this public health emergency has in itself created an economic emergency. It estimates that Scotland's economic output could fall by a third during this current period of social distancing, an analysis which is broadly in line with last week's projections for the UK as a whole from the Office for Budget Responsibility. The labour market statistics on employment and unemployment, which have also been published today, don't fully reflect that impact yet, since they relate to the period up until the end of February, so a period before these restrictions took effect. It is, however, likely that there has been a significant increase in unemployment since then. For example, since the 15th of March, we know there have been 130,000 new claimants for universal credit in Scotland. And to give some context to that, in the comparable period last year, that number was 15,500. The Scottish Government's immediate focus, working with the UK Government, of course, has been on trying to mitigate the impact of this economic shock on people's well-being and on protecting the economy's productive capacity for the future. Our overall package of support for businesses in Scotland now totals more than £2.3 billion. That includes business rates relief for many sectors and grants for small businesses. The Economy Secretary will set out later today in Parliament how £100 million of funding that we announced last week will be used to support people, for example, people who have become recently self-employed who might not currently be eligible for other forms of support. Fundamentally, and this is a point I have made previously, we recognise that in order to protect public health, the government is making extraordinary demands on businesses and workers. We are asking you to do unprecedented things. So we recognise that the responsibility and onus is on government to equally do extraordinary things and provide extraordinary levels of support for businesses and workers. And we will continue to do everything we can to meet that challenge. It's also worth adding that the health of the economy is, of course, one of the things we must consider as we think about how to emerge from this period of lockdown. The plans we will publish this week will set out some of the factors we will have to weigh up as we work towards a point when we can allow some businesses to reopen, albeit with appropriate social distancing measures in place. But the economic harm being caused by this virus is not in itself a reason to come out of lockdown early. Indeed, dealing with this public health emergency and continuing to suppress the virus is an absolute prerequisite for a sustainable economic recovery. If we were to move out of lockdown too early and then have to impose the same level of restrictions again due to a further rapid rise in cases, that would in itself cause further and possibly much longer lasting economic damage. So these are decisions that we have to strike the right balance on for the good of the country overall, and that is what we will seek to do. The work that I've mentioned that we will publish towards the end of this week will set out in some more detail the principles that will guide us as we seek to restore as much normality as we can to everyday life without risking a resurgence of this virus that we know can and is doing so much harm. That point is actually related to the second issue I want to briefly speak on. We've today amended regulations introduced 3 weeks ago to restrict public gatherings and non-essential business activities. Some of these amendments strengthen those regulations to formalise what is already our established guidance. For example, all businesses must take all reasonable measures to enforce the rule that workers are at least 2 metres apart from each other. Police, as a result of these amended regulations, will now be able to enforce that power within workplaces. Though, as with the regulations already in place, we envisage that this will be done primarily through dialogue and encouragement. We do not expect police to be routinely patrolling office blocks. The legislation will also make clear that livestock markets and money advice services such as foreign exchange services can continue to operate, and that holiday accommodation businesses can manage online and telephone services for bookings not for this period but related to future dates. However, let me be clear, it's not yet possible to say when such establishments will be able to reopen. I am very grateful, just as I am to every individual across the country who is complying with these restrictions. I'm very grateful to all businesses who've acted responsibly by closing their businesses or by ensuring safe social distancing. I know how tough these restrictions are for business. However, I would reiterate that they are absolutely essential to public health. The final issue I want to briefly cover is related to mental health. When I spoke to you last Tuesday, I said then that the Scottish Government would launch a new mental health campaign. That campaign, the Clear Your Head campaign, starts today. It highlights practical steps that all of us can take to look after our mental health better. For example, sticking to a routine, staying active within the current guidelines, keeping in touch with people and taking a break from news or social media from time to time, although clearly not during the daily update that we give. It also points people to places where you can get help and advice, for example, NHS Inform and helplines including NHS 24 Breathing Space, the Samaritans and the Scottish Association for Mental Health. What the campaign recognises is that the current lockdown is really tough for everyone. Everyone will be experiencing it differently, but it is tough for everyone without exception. And it is okay not to be feeling okay at times right now. So we all need to look out for each other, to show kindness, compassion, solidarity, even as we stay physically separate. We should also do what we can to look after our own mental health, and the campaign provides good advice on that. But if you need help, please reach out for it. Support is available, and the campaign that will launch today will show you where and how you can access that support. Now, I'm about to hand over briefly to the Chief Medical Officer and then to the Chief Economist, who will say more about the State of the Economy report. Before I do that, however, just let me again emphasise once again our key public health messages, because it is really important if we are to see that continued downward trend in people in intensive care leading to that downward trend in the number of people dying. We must all comply with these restrictions. Stay at home unless you're going out for essential purposes, such as food or medicine or exercising. If you do go out, stay 2 metres away from other people and don't meet up with people from other households. Wash your hands regularly and thoroughly. And by doing all of that, you are helping us make sure that we suppress this virus and bring forward that time when we can restore some normality. Now, as I keep saying, and I will keep saying, these restrictions are tough and they will get tougher, not easier. And I know everybody is feeling that increasingly, but they are essential. And as some, if not all of the statistics that I've given you today show, they are making a difference. By staying at home, we are helping to slow the spread of this virus. We are, as I have talked about already, protecting the National Health Service, and we are saving lives. So thank you once again to all of you for your cooperation and compliance. I'll hand over now to Dr. Gregor Smith to say a few words, and then I'll hand to the Chief Economist.
Thank you, First Minister. All of us are experiencing huge personal change as we adapt to a new way of living as a result of the restrictions placed upon us by COVID-19. Now more than ever, it's important that we all take the steps possible to look after ourselves. Eating well, staying active are really important for both our physical health and our mental well-being. Eating a healthy, balanced diet, which includes a variety of different foods, will help ensure that you get all the essential nutrients and energy you need for throughout the day. We're all adjusting to different ways that we buy or access food, and that can take more planning or the use of lists to try to limit the time we spend at the supermarket. But food's an important part of our daily lives and something that many of us enjoy. It's also an important time for people to connect with each other, and that may involve new ways of eating together virtually if you have technology that allows that. Because loneliness is a terrible and harmful thing to experience, and my ask of you is to reach out to people you know are alone at times when this may be especially important. Whether it be a phone call, a text or a video message, we need connections with others in our everyday lives more than ever. Also, investing time in ourselves to remain physically active is important. It helps manage stress and is essential for a healthy mind and body. Lots of exercise can be taken at home, but you can also go outside to exercise once per day too. Please remember though to stay local and to observe the 2-metre social distancing rules when you do this. The internet's flooded with helpful guides on exercise in your home and hints and tips to stay active. This can be done as a family to make it more enjoyable too. And staying physically active is especially important as you get older. Low-impact exercise that focuses on strength and balance can help you stay healthy and maintain your independence too. If you're self-isolating because of you or your household has symptoms, or you're defined as being extremely vulnerable and shielding, you shouldn't leave home. But that doesn't mean you should stop moving if you're still able to. It's really important to keep moving if you feel well enough. But if you feel unwell, you should avoid activity and use your energy to concentrate on getting better. This is a stressful time for people. Sometimes, when we feel this way, we use substances like tobacco or alcohol more than we usually do. But we know that both of these habits can be harmful, particularly in relation to coronavirus. Evidence suggests that smoking may contribute to the severity of COVID-19 disease, and we know that people who smoke are much more likely to experience other respiratory infections such as flu. Please, if you can, try to cut down or even stop your smoking. But if you continue, please remember to wash your hands before and after so that there's less opportunity for the virus to spread. Similarly, alcohol can also reduce the immune system's ability to fight off infectious disease and also have an impact on your heart and your lungs. Choosing to cut back on how much you drink may reduce some of the complications linked to coronavirus. We know life isn't easy just now and that everyone is doing their best. The NHS wants to be able to support you where we can. There's lots of information to be found in these topics on the NHS Inform website, and some further specific COVID-19 related pages will be launched soon to provide more information about steps that you can take to help you through this period in your home.
Thank you, Gregor. And I'll hand over now to Gary Gillespie, the Chief Economist.
Okay, thank you very much, First Minister, and good afternoon. So I'll highlight briefly some of the key points from the analysis which we published earlier today, which shows the impact of COVID-19 on the economy in Scotland. As the First Minister has previously noted, COVID-19 has created an economic crisis, given both the scale and speed of the action required in order to support the public health effort, which is our main priority. This has meant the temporary closure of many businesses, a shift to remote and safe working for other businesses, and the need to ensure strict social distancing for businesses which are operating and providing essential services. We estimate in today's report that around 22% of economic activity in Scotland has been strictly closed, which has impacted over 900,000 jobs and over 1/3 of the business base, including the self-employed. Including the wider knock-on effects, we estimate a drop in economic output in Scotland of around 1/3 over the period in which the current social distancing has been in place. As the First Minister has mentioned, this is broadly in line with the estimates for the UK, which were published by the OBR last week, which suggested a contraction in Q2 of around 35%. This was also confirmed by the OECD and their earlier analysis for the UK, again suggesting numbers of around 25%. We're also starting to see the impacts in the labour market, with estimates from the Office of National Statistics showing that around 1/5 of workers who are in employment are currently furloughed, and we're starting to see a significant rise in those applying for universal credit, as the First Minister has already noted. Again, as the First Minister has noted, the labour market data published today don't relate to this period. They cover the period up to the end of March and show numbers for Scotland that still reflect the pre-pandemic period where unemployment rates were below 4%. Unfortunately, we will see unemployment rising in Scotland, and we will see that reflected in subsequent data. COVID-19 is also impacting the global economy, which is forecast to contract this year for the first time since the financial crisis in 2009. We've seen major disruption to international markets, trade, supply chains, inward investment and travel. This has been reflected in global stock markets, equities and commodities, particularly oil, which is an important sector for the economy in Scotland. The speed and scale of impacts is significant, but it's important to recognise that this is different from a normal economic downturn and needs to be viewed in that context. The economic policy response, again as the First Minister has noted, is about protecting capacity in the economy. The scale of the response has been significant, with direct employment support alongside loan guarantees, tax deferrals and grants. This is also greater and more comprehensive than was provided for the financial crisis of 2008-09. The recovery for the economy needs to mirror our success in managing the pandemic. Otherwise, we risk undermining the collective efforts to date. The shape of the economic recovery is therefore linked to the ongoing health response and the extent to which economic activity can restart and operate in line with the wider health requirements. Our analysis published today also illustrates various scenarios for the recovery of the economy in Scotland, reflecting both the immediate uncertainty around the pathway to lifting restrictions, but also the broader global risk from a wider downturn and the scope for a stimulus both in the UK and global economy. Finally, the path and timing for recovery depend on a range of factors. Not all sectors will come back immediately, as external demand, consumer tastes and business models have changed. So we need to plan our recovery alongside our health effort to support the safe and sustainable return of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. We'll move straight on now to questions from journalists. I'll go first to Glenn Campbell from BBC.
First Minister, is any amount of economic damage a price worth paying in the effort to save lives? And given the emphasis on saving lives, can you update us on the prevalence of COVID-19 in our care homes and explain why we've been unable to prevent mass deaths in some care homes?
On the first point about the economy, I tried to cover this briefly in my opening remarks. I think it is wrong and potentially quite dangerous to see this, although I can understand the temptation, as a trade-off between health and saving lives on the one hand and protecting the economy on the other. The only firm, solid basis for a sustainable economic recovery is a population that is not facing the threat of a rampaging virus. And while we understand the deep damage, and Gary has covered it, of the lockdown measures in our economy, which is why it's important to take the action that is being taken to try to protect as much of the productive capacity as the economy as possible, it is equally true to say that if we come out of lockdown early, and if that results in a resurgence of the virus and a necessity then to reimpose lockdown measures, perhaps even impose stricter lockdown measures, the damage that will do to the economy is potentially even greater and perhaps even more long-lasting. So we've got to see these two things as part of the same challenge. The only way we can get out of the health crisis and the economic crisis is by seeing both of these things as interlinked challenges, not as things that are in competition with each other. On the question about care homes, we'll publish tomorrow. We have been publishing figures on the cumulative number of care homes that have had outbreaks of COVID-19. From tomorrow, we will be publishing information that tells us on a active basis how many care homes have currently got outbreaks of COVID-19. In terms of your question about, we will also see tomorrow in the National Records of Scotland figures, as we did last week, the breakdown in terms of those who've sadly died from the virus, the location of death, so the percentage of those that have been in care homes. This is a virus that we know, there's lots we don't know about this virus still, but we know that older people are more susceptible to becoming seriously ill and dying. We also know that this virus spreads faster in institutional settings, which is why we have been and continue to work so hard to prevent the virus getting into care homes, but to make sure the right procedures and policies and actions are in place to try to limit its spread when there are cases in care homes. We've taken a number of actions to date. We are asking public health directors to lead that work in local areas with health protection teams and the care inspectorate, making sure that care providers are properly supported to do that. And that will continue even as we see, as I hope we will continue to see, evidence that community transmission of this virus is reducing. That focus on institutions, care homes and also hospitals where we know through nosocomial infection that there is a risk of greater transmission there, these will continue to be a real focus of our attention. Do you want to say any more, Gregor, about the work in care homes?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's one of the saddest aspects of this pandemic as we've watched it unfold globally has been the impact that it's had on the most vulnerable in our society, and right across the world we've seen that residents of care homes have been particularly badly affected by this. I read through a number of reports over the course of the weekend which looked at different countries' experience, and let me tell you, it was very, very sobering to see just the scale of the impact. We are taking a number of measures and in trying to kind of enhance those now. as well, as we learn more about the virus and the ways that it is being spread. And we have a number of clinicians who are actively working in this area, even as we speak, to make sure that everything that we can possibly do to try to offer more protection to these residents is being done.
Thank you. Jim Matthews from Sky.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Given what you've just said and what we've heard from Dr. Gregor Smith, given that the situation in care homes was foreseen, the dangers were foreseen, how would you rate your government's performance on the prevention of deaths in care homes, given the figures we have coming out of care homes? 16 in a care home in Dumbarton just yesterday. How would you rate your performance?
I think there is a need on an ongoing basis, and there will come a point where there is a need to look back at all governments and the actions they have taken. So I think that is both necessary and appropriate, and it's also entirely legitimate. I don't want to simplify this in the way that your question is inviting me to do, because these are serious issues that we have been working to address since the start of this epidemic, since before it hit in the way it has, and we will continue to do. What we have seen in countries all over the world is the impact that this is having in care homes for the reasons that I've already set out, which I won't repeat. So we have given clear guidance to care home providers about how they isolate residents to try to minimise infection spreading in care homes, getting into care homes in the first place. We are continuing to work with care home providers, offer that support. We have set out last week the developments in the way we're using testing in our care homes, which, as I said last week, doesn't change how cases are clinically managed. So these are ongoing challenges that remain incredibly important for us to learn as we go and make sure that we're learning from our own experience and from other countries to do everything we can to provide that protection and that support to those in care homes. But to echo what Gregor said, there is no aspect of what we are dealing with just now that is not difficult and challenging, and at times deeply upsetting for all of us living through this. But the most upsetting aspect of this, I think, for anybody is to hear and listen to reports of older residents in care homes contracting this virus and sadly dying from this, particularly at a time when, because of what has been done to try to prevent infection, their relatives are not able to visit them in the same way that they would be normally. So, everybody feels the importance and the priority of this intensely, and that's why we will continue to work with the experts advising us and, of course, with care home providers to make sure that everything possible is being done on an ongoing basis. Tim Backshall from ITV Borders.
Good afternoon. The Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack has warned that the economy of the south of Scotland could be damaged if the Scottish Government decides on a different timetable for lifting the lockdown from the rest of the UK. And a local MSP, Colin Smith, is today warning of mixed messages on lifting the lockdown. But will you be mindful of cross-border travel and trade when making your decision?
I'll be mindful of all of these things. I've alluded to the work we'll publish towards the end of this week, which starts to set out the multitude of factors that we have to take into account and weigh up and come to balanced judgments around. When I hear comments like that, though, what I always caution myself against and caution other people against is this idea that you take some kind of predetermined, almost ideological position on these things, instead of coming at this from a position of what is the best approach to protect the Scottish population and, as part of that, to protect the Scottish economy. So let me say two things. I will not stick with an overall approach if the evidence and my judgment tells me that something different would work better for Scotland, but nor will I come at this with a determination to do something different for Scotland just for the sake of it. I am trying every single day right now to come to the best judgments I can based on all of the considerations and factors I have to take into account. And my driving objective here is, as far as I can, to do the things that are best to protect the Scottish population, to suppress this virus in Scotland, and to make sure that as we do that, we are taking account of all of these other factors. This is not some kind of normal political issue where we might come at it with these predetermined, preset positions. This is far too important for that. And that's why I will try to make these judgments in the best possible way. And I would caution everybody to come at it in that way rather than apply perhaps small p political considerations to what they consider the best thing to be. Our only consideration here is what's best for Scotland. If that is to have a UK approach, we should do that. And if it's to do something different, as we've done in a couple of instances already, then we should do that. That should be what drives us. Peter Smith, ITV News.
Hi, First Minister. Thank you very much. There's been a report today in Open Democracy that says that a leak from Public Health England documents shows that the COVID-19 testing that's been used in the NHS in England is deeply flawed and unreliable. And as many of a quarter of the tests that have been done have given false negatives. That's 25% of positive cases just haven't been picked up at all. Can either the First Minister or Scotland's Chief Medical Officer tell us, are these same tests that are being used by the NHS in England being used here in Scotland? And were you aware of these concerns over the tests being unreliable? And what are you now going to do?
I haven't seen the piece you're talking about. I'd be interested to look at it, obviously. I've said a couple of things repeatedly. Well, one thing repeatedly, but if you look at the testing figures that we publish, we do often do more tests than there are people tested, because as we've reflected previously, sometimes people will be tested more than once for a variety of different reasons. But I've stood at this podium many times and talked about the inherent limitations of the testing that we're doing, which is not to say it's not important and that we are not trying to do more of it, because we are, but the fact that it will not be reliable before somebody's got symptoms and will not be reliable after somebody has cleared symptoms, and that's why sometimes we've got to be careful about saying that it can do more than it can. So these are points that I've made repeatedly. Obviously, if there's more detail in the piece, I'm happy to come back once I've had an opportunity to consider that in greater depth. But Gregor, I don't know if you want to say any more.
Yeah, I was made aware of the report that you're speaking about just earlier on this morning, and I know that Public Health Scotland are liaising very closely with Public Health England just now, just to understand exactly the nature of the issues that they've experienced with this testing, and following that discussion, we'll be able to kind of fully assess what impact, if any, that has had on our Scottish testing programme.
Ross Govins from STV.
Yes, First Minister, a question on the economy, if I may. US oil's plunged into negative territory for the first time. North Sea crude is actually being sold for less than it was at the height of the recent downturn, and thousands of Scottish jobs are now at risk. Will you be pushing the Chancellor to intervene to help to safeguard jobs in the sector? And what more can your government do to mitigate possible losses?
Well, the situation with the oil price that we saw at its most acute last night with the American oil price, but obviously has obvious implications for Brent crude and the North Sea. That will be one of the many things that we are considering ourselves, what actions we need to take, just as we took certain actions over the course of the oil price downturn a few years ago, but also will form part of our discussions with the UK government, because obviously many of the levers there are held at Westminster. But I'll maybe hand over to Gary to say a word or two about the position with oil and gas and how that fits into the bigger economic challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, First Minister. It's a really good example, I suppose, of the global impact of this pandemic and how quickly it can magnify itself in particular sectors. Just a couple of points. So obviously, we've seen an unprecedented fall in demand for oil, which was reflected in the initial sharp falls we've seen in the price from around $50 a barrel to 30 and below. And we've also seen supply continuing at previous levels, but now adjustments happen in supply. So originally the supply was able to be supported by enhanced storage, but what we've seen yesterday in the market, particularly for Western Texas Intermediary, which is the benchmark for the US, is that the end of the forward contract period becoming to an end. So the way oil is typically sold is you sell on a future contract. So we've seen contractors actually offloading oil because they couldn't get storage for it. So that's an example of how acute the situation is in that sector. But what I would say about the sector in general is the oil and gas sector is resilient in Scotland. It's been through these types of cycles before, and the market will remain volatile until the path to recovery is clear. We've seen a massive fall in demand, supply reducing to some extent, and real issues around storage. And finally, the benchmark for the UK is obviously the crude Brent oil, and again, that's stabilising a little bit, albeit at low levels. I think we've seen forward contracts for June around $20 a barrel, which is really challenging for the sector. But the sector in Scotland is more productive, more profitable, and with some support can see through this.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Fraser Knight from LBC.
First Minister, we've been told this morning to expect schools in Scotland to remain closed until at least the summer holidays. Now, presumably, if we are to see a second or a third or even a fourth wave of COVID-19, as has been suggested, presumably that would lead to even more time off schools. Now, this morning, we've heard from teachers saying that the current SQA guidance issued last night for exams could lead to a rise in the attainment gap, a widening of the attainment gap. And if we have further time off schools, then presumably that would make it even worse. First Minister, do we potentially face a generation of deprived families who are not only struggling to heat their homes and eat, but could also now be uneducated?
Look, that is a situation obviously we will work to ensure doesn't happen. These are not easy challenges to deal with, but they are part of the overall situation that we are working our way and navigating our way through. Can I just be clear? Firstly, on the timetable for schools potentially reopening, we haven't taken any decisions on that yet. We're not yet in a position to take that decision with confidence. So what the Deputy First Minister said this morning is in line with the comment I made when we announced the closure of schools. If you recall back then, that was before the Easter holidays, and I said that young people should not be expecting to go back to school after the Easter holidays, and at that stage we could not guarantee that schools would reopen before the summer holidays. That remains the position. But it is not the case that we have taken a decision that schools will not open before the summer holidays. That decision will be driven by the wider work we are doing, assessing how we can continue to suppress this virus while restoring as much normality to life as possible. We'll set out the key principles that will drive that later this week, and that work will develop with harder data and metrics attached to it in the couple of weeks to come. So I don't want people taking from any comments that have been made today that there is a definite decision that schools will not reopen before the summer, because that is not the case. What we said when we closed schools still remains the position. On the point about the SQA, these are issues that the SQA have been looking at very carefully and coming to decisions in a very, very considered way. And the reason they've been doing that, the reason this has been such a careful process, is because we are determined to have a system in place, given that we can't have exams this year, that does not deepen or embed disadvantage. So the assessment this year will be based on the judgment of teachers, because our judgment is that teachers are best placed to understand the young people that they teach and make those judgments about their performance. But there will be a process that is gone through by the SQA there of checking and validating those judgments, and where necessary, moderating them, so that it takes into account the past performance of a school, the differences perhaps between prelims and exams, and also the past achievements of young people. So that the process is being and will continue to be designed as carefully as possible to ensure that we don't embed disadvantage there, because the whole thrust of our education approach and policy is to raise excellence in our schools, but also increase equity and close the attainment gap. This is a very challenging set of circumstances to be doing that in, but we don't lose sight of those principles as we try to navigate our way through this particular difficulty. Can I go now to Kenny McBride from Broadcasting Scotland?
Hello? Yes, thank you, First Minister. Given the Sunday Times article this week, which was so scathing about Boris Johnson's complacency in the face of the pandemic, do you now think that the Four Nations approach was a mistake for Scotland? And was your decision to pursue that approach affected in any way by the media in Scotland, who, for example, this week have seen fit to declare the case for independence dead, even as we've learned that the decisions made by the UK government to ignore WHO advice may have cost hundreds, if not thousands, of lives?
No, I don't think it was a mistake, and no, it wasn't driven by the media in any way. I mean, I'll refer back to an answer I gave a moment ago, and this may or may not disappoint anybody who wants to try to make what the very traumatic situation we're living through right now, and I mean traumatic in a health sense, an economic sense, an emotional sense for people, to try to reduce that to politics. I don't really have space in my head or my day right now to do anything other than try to navigate the best way forward for the country to get us in as good a way through this crisis as I possibly can, and that's what I'll continue to focus on. Trying to do things in a four nations way, given the geography of the four nations and three of those nations in particular, seems to me to make sense. This is a virus. It doesn't respect borders or boundaries, and we see people moving freely across the four nations. So it makes sense that if we are to be as effective as possible in combating this virus, we've got to align our activity as much as possible. And of course, some of the decisions about how we manage the impact of this, the quantity of economic and business support, given that borrowing power still lie with the UK government, demands and rests on decisions that are taken there. But that said, I will never be a prisoner of that if something different is required for Scotland. And we have taken different decisions on some issues where we thought that was necessary. We decided to move away from mass gatherings a bit earlier. We announced the closure of schools a little bit earlier. The lockdown, when it came earlier in the spread of the infection in Scotland. And of course, we are taking a slightly tougher approach when it comes to business closure. Construction, for example, being an example of that, where we are saying to non-essential construction sites that they should be closed where there is different advice elsewhere. So we will take the decision. I will take the decisions I think are right for Scotland. So I go back. This is where I go back to my earlier answer. I'm not going to not do what is right for Scotland because I want to stay in a four nations approach, although I think the importance of aligning is obvious for the reasons I've given. But nor am I going to come at this from the perspective of saying I must do something different for Scotland for the sake of it, if that is not the right thing to do. So I am going to continue just now trying to do the right things and reach the right judgments about how we save lives in Scotland, protect our NHS and suppress this virus. And over the coming weeks, make the judgments about how we do all of that with restoring as much normality to life as possible. And I will be driven by what I judge, with all the advice and the evidence that I have access to, by what I judge to be in the best interests of the people I serve, which is the people of Scotland. But it will not be a traditional political calculation. It will be a calculation and a judgment driven by protecting the people of Scotland from this massive public health emergency. Tom Eden from PA.
First Minister, kind of following on from that really, if you do decide that the right thing for Scotland is to extend the lockdown measures beyond that of the rest of the UK, have you got any assurance from the Chancellor or the UK government that the furlough scheme, they'll continue to financially support furloughed workers if you've taken the decision to extend lockdown measures further?
No, we haven't got to that stage. These are discussions we will continue to have within the Four Nations framework, because for a variety of reasons, not least the ones I've spoken about, the virus not respecting borders or boundaries, the more alignment we can have across the Four Nations, the better, as long as we judge that that is the right course of action for Scotland. So we will continue to take these judgments, take these decisions, make these calculations and reach points of decision in that way, and have these discussions along the way. I come back to a point of, it's an obvious point, but it is worth making. None of this is easy. None of this is without horrendous complexity and difficulty, but we've got to make these decisions for the right reasons, informed by the best advice and judgment that we can get, and have the clear objective in mind. This is not about differentiating ourselves for the sake of it. It's about taking the decisions, as I have done at every stage, that I judge to be right for the people of Scotland. In the fullness of time, there'll be plenty of people that scrutinise these decisions retrospectively and no doubt say we should have done this, that or the next thing differently. But I can only deal with the situation as it is before me right now, learning as we go and taking the decisions that are right for Scotland. And that's what I'm determined to do each and every day that we're living through this crisis, and hopefully as we get into the recovery period from it as well. Simon Johnson from The Telegraph.
Just going back to Mr. Swinney's statement on schools this morning, as you pointed out, you did say back when schools shut that parents might not see them open before summer. But Mr. Swinney's statement this morning did seem to go quite a bit further, saying you expect something to happen, i.e. expecting them to be closed until at least the summer break, seems to be quite a bit stronger. I just wanted to get clarification, because I'm sure parents might be a little bit confused given what you just said to the previous answer. Do you expect schools to reopen before the summer break? Yes or no?
I can't give you a yes or no answer to that, Simon, for obvious reasons. I don't yet have the evidence and data that would allow me to give a yes or a no answer in a way that I was confident that my answer was the right thing to do for the protection of the Scottish people. And just a bit like my answers on politics, I'm not going to be driven in these decisions by politics, and I'm not going to be driven by, let me say, the understandable demands of journalists to get simplistic yes or no answers to questions that, frankly, are a lot more complex than that. And I think, with genuine respect, I think you know that it's. Well, I'm coming on. I'm coming on to the Deputy First Minister point, because the other thing I would say is we're not robots, we're human beings, and sometimes human beings articulate the same things using slightly different words. But let me be clear, the position is as it was when I announced the closure of schools. There is no change in that. So if anybody thought there was, hopefully this gives people the clarity that there's not. We said, and this bit has turned out to be true, that we said to people that they shouldn't expect to be going back to school after the Easter holidays, and that has turned out to be the case. And we couldn't guarantee that they would be going back before the summer holidays. That remains the case. But that is not to say that they will definitely not be going back before the summer holidays. That decision hasn't been taken yet, and it hasn't been taken for very good reasons, because we don't yet have the information that would allow us to take that decision in a responsible, informed and considered way. And as soon as we are in the position to take that decision, I will, or the Deputy First Minister will communicate that to parents and to the wider public. And as I have said a few times already today, later this week, we will not set out the answer to that question, but we will set out some of the considerations that we will have to be taking account of over the next couple of weeks to arrive at that decision. But we will do it for the right reasons, based on the best evidence we've got. And as I keep saying, throughout all of this, I will continue to resist being driven by considerations of party politics or by the demands of the news cycle, even although I completely understand the frustrations of journalists to have clarity that fits with the news cycle. I'm sure you'll equally understand why I'm going to resist that. Christine Lavelle from The Sun.
Hi, First Minister. It was just on the SQA guidance. You've said today that this system won't embed disadvantage, but given that SQA might modify grades based on schools' previous exam performance, do you accept that this means some pupils might be punished for their schools' past failures? And that's likely to affect children in the most deprived areas of the country the most?
Well, that's so the point I'm making here is that is what the SQA is seeking, has sought to design a process to avoid. So if I can maybe try to put this as simply as I can, the process is designed to promote fairness. They are having to put a process in place that takes account of the fact that exams are not taking place as normal. So you are, as we are in so many aspects of life right now, not in the most ideal position that we would want to be in. But the process is designed to promote fairness. So in short, it's designed to ensure that, for example, an A pass in one school means the same as an A pass in any other school, or a B pass does. So the moderation and the checking that SQA will do to that teacher judgment-based system is about ensuring that there is fairness in that. And I'm sure we can ask the SQA or the Deputy First Minister to set out as much information as possible to give assurance to parents and to young people that that's very much the focus of what they're trying to achieve. Can I move now to Tom Martin at the Express?
Hi, good afternoon, First Minister. Just going back to the economy, despite the changes that were made to the grant system last week, some firms are still raising concerns about what they describe as gaps in the system and additional clauses which they wouldn't experience under the UK government scheme. I just wondered what your message would be to those firms who feel they are being penalised for trading in Scotland.
No firm should feel like that, and we will work with sectors and with individual companies to address any concerns as we have done. So I don't know in particular what examples you're talking about there, but the Economy Secretary will be making a statement in Parliament this afternoon. We'll be happy, as will the Finance Secretary, to engage closely to see if there are further adaptations and changes we need to make. Well, two things I would say in addition to that. Firstly, the totality of the package of support that we are now providing to businesses across Scotland is £2.3 billion, which is exceeding the £2.2 billion that came from the consequentials from the decisions of the UK government. So I think we're already demonstrating that where we can, we want to go even further beyond the schemes and the systems that have been put in place at UK level. There are aspects, I've covered this at briefings before, there are aspects of what we are providing that go beyond in detail what is in place in the rest of the UK. For example, the support to the fishing sector, some of the work we've done to provide support to the bus sector, support for water rates. There are companies at a low level of rateable value that get grants in Scotland that wouldn't get grants in England. And the £100 million that we announced last week that Fiona Hislop will announce more detail about this afternoon is specifically about trying to plug some of the gaps for groups, and I cited earlier on those who've been recently self-employed that currently aren't eligible for any of the Scottish or the UK schemes. So I say that to make the point that we are constantly on an ongoing basis looking as far as is possible, because obviously there are financial constraints that we operate within, but as far as possible we want to plug those gaps and make sure that businesses get the support that they need, and that will be an ongoing dialogue that we are happy to have with businesses and with business organisations and with different sectors of the economy. Paul Mallock from the Courier.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Following yesterday's announcement that fewer people are visiting GPs, aside from encouraging people to visit now when they have symptoms, do you have plans in place to deal with the inevitable backlog in primary care in the next 3 to 4 months or at the end of the lockdown? And if so, are you able to say what these are?
I'm not able to get into detail about them just now, but suffice to say that part of our planning and thinking and consideration for moving from where we are now back to something that is closer to, it will not be back to normal completely because we'll be living with this virus for some time to come, but closer to normal will be how we recover the position in the health service given the cancellation of non-urgent electives and the real focus and orientation of the health service in recent weeks towards dealing with COVID. So that is all part of our thinking and planning, which as we move through the transition phase, we will set out in more detail. Chris McCall from the Scotsman.
Hi, good afternoon, First Minister. Could I also return to the economic report published today? I was wondering if you could tell us if the Scottish Government has assessed how long the economy can sustain the current lockdown restrictions and whether there is a tipping point after which the economy could fail to recover to pre-lockdown levels.
I'll hand over to the Chief Economist who can talk a bit more about the analysis in the report published today.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, First Minister. So I suppose the first point to note here is that the levels, the drops we're seeing in activity and the indexes of operations and production are unprecedented. So they're not, this isn't a normal time, it isn't a normal economic downturn. And in a sense, the figure we published today around a drop in capacity of around a third has to be viewed in that context. Obviously, the longer any period of uncertainty or lockdown or slowdown in activity continues, the more risk there is to the economy. And unfortunately, we've seen businesses that have closed during this period to date. The economic policy response, as noted, is about saving as much productive capacity as we can so that when the recovery comes, that can safely come back on stream. So I think the obvious answer is we need to get through this period. We need to get through it in a way that is compliant with the health guidance, and we need to reopen the economy in a safe and transparent way. The risks of further contagion or other impacts, in the report today we modelled some other scenarios, and the worst thing we can do is lift the restrictions too quickly and end up back in with a further collapse in demand and other restrictions coming back on. That's shown in our report, where we simulate a return to those type of measures in Q4 2020, and in all scenarios it's the worst case scenario. So I think the key thing for business is access the support that's there. Think about how you'll return safely to production, and don't be overly influenced by all the negative data that's out there, including my own report, because it's there to serve a purpose. It's there to show you the scale of it, but actually the scale of response and support is there also, and we can get through this and recover in a safe and sustainable way.
Thanks, Gary. Helen Puttock from The Times. Helen.
Okay, sorry. As I'm sure you recognise, the uncertainty about going back to school also has a huge effect on children. My own children ask me over and over again when they can go back to school. It's not just journalists who feel they would like stronger answers on that at some point. And there is also a vacuum of standards for home education and information about what parents can expect from the schools. And so I wondered, in the time that a new hospital has been built, what has been done to put those standards in place? And also if you're looking at rearranging the school summer holidays so that children potentially could have some contact with their school before August, should the lockdown come down before then?
All of these things will be considered, and let me clarify, I didn't suggest it's only journalists that are interested about when schools go back. I absolutely understand the interest that every parent and indeed every young person in the country has. My own niece, who before schools closed was encouraging me to take the decision to close them, as many young people would have probably been thinking of at the time, is now on a daily basis asking me when they're going to reopen. So, you know, everybody wants that, but I also think from the contact I have from parents is that what parents want to know is not just when are schools reopening, but fundamentally when can schools safely reopen, so that they have confidence that they are sending their children to school safely, and that the act of sending their children to school is not risking a resurgence of a virus that can do so much damage to individuals right across the country. So these are not easy judgments, but there are judgments that have to be taken properly, with the right considerations and in the right time frame, and that's what I undertake to do, and to communicate both the processes we go through to come to these decisions, and as soon as possible communicate the decisions as well. As well as what I said about Easter and summer when we closed the schools, I said, and this remains the case, I don't want schools to be closed for a day longer than is absolutely necessary. So people can take it from me that we want to get schools open again for all of the reasons that people can understand, but we must proceed now in a way that protects the country from a resurgence of a virus that, as we see, is capable of killing people, is capable, if it gets out of control, of overwhelming our National Health Service with the added damage that will do, and doing even more damage to our economy. So these are decisions we have to take carefully and in a fully considered manner, and that's what we will continue to do. Tom Peterkin from the P&J.
Good afternoon, First Minister. I'd like to come back to the falling oil price. Oil and Gas UK have called on both the UK and Scottish governments for support. I'm just wondering if you can, and staff are already being cut back in the industry, I just wonder if you can clarify what more support can you as a Scottish government offer, and will you be, what will you be pressing Westminster for packages beyond business loans and existing job retention schemes?
Well, these will be discussions we're having I understand, absolutely understand why the oil and gas sector is the source of many of these questions today, given what we're seeing around the oil price. But these are discussions we're having with different sectors across the economy to make sure, as I said in response to an earlier question, that we are using all of the resources and levers we have at our disposal, and that will continue with oil and gas as it will with all sectors, but also where most of the levers, and this is certainly true with oil and gas, most of these levers, because much of the financial regime around the North Sea is reserved to the UK government, much of the decision-making lies there. So we will be seeking to discuss with the sector and discuss with the UK government what support is appropriate. But that is happening across the whole of the economy right now, particularly, of course, the sectors that are most acutely affected. Vivian Aitken from the Daily Record.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Last week you talked about the future of Scotland's economy being a greener, fairer society. I think we've all noticed a difference in terms of pollution and return to wildlife since lockdown. So in that respect, will there be incentives for businesses to continue to have their staff working from home after the lockdown?
Well, let me answer that question in general, and you'll forgive me and understand that I'm not yet in a position to go into specifics and particulars about the different forms of support and financial interventions that we may make longer term for businesses. But I think, I certainly feel this very strongly, although, again, as you will understand, much of my, most, if not all of my focus right now is on the immediate steps we need to take to get us through this crisis. I think all of us understand that not just in terms of the need for continued social distancing and measures to suppress this virus, that we won't go back to normal in a broader sense either. And in some respects, nor should we want to go back to normal. But the ways in which we will want to use the traumatic experience we're living through right now to try to make these fundamental changes, I think we need to think through properly and carefully. There is undoubtedly an opportunity to look at the things, not just in terms of more home working that we've seen, but if I look in the public sector, Helen a moment ago talked about how quickly we've managed to build a hospital. Now, I'm not suggesting we would build hospitals in that way or in that time frame routinely, but we've also done other things in the health service. We've much more quickly rolled out some digital systems that had previously been taking a long time to do. So there are things that, out of necessity, we've had to adapt in order to do quickly that we will want to look at in the longer term. And while none of us would have wanted to live through this virus, there will be ways in which we've had to adapt to it that we will not want to lose in terms of how we start to rebuild and recover. And I think all of us have hopes that we do come out of this with a greater impetus towards the cleaner, greener, net zero economy we want to have, but also that we see a much greater focus in tackling inequality, much greater premium on fairness, and the kind of principles we've been talking about through this crisis, like love and kindness and solidarity, that we should dare to hope that these are not just values that we talk about during times of acute crisis, but we can actually come out of this and see these values actually become the hallmarks of how we do things and how we live our lives more generally. So there's much of that over the fullness of time we will be able to talk much more about. Rachel Watson from the Mail.
First Minister, it was mentioned earlier that there's a number of firms who are still unhappy at the differences between business support in Scotland and England. On Friday, Kate Forbes was asked whether she would look at reallocating funds from the Scottish Government's budget for pledges such as the expansion of free childcare, which have been delayed, to help expand support for businesses in Scotland. Given the figures on the economy today, is that something the Scottish Government is willing to look at?
We are already looking at how we reallocate money within our own budget. So I've already spoken about the fact that the business support we're giving in totality now exceeds the consequential funding we got from Westminster, but in a whole range of other areas that will be true as well, whether it's the money we've given to local authorities and third sector organisations to prioritise food security, talking about some of that yesterday, or the money that we are investing to build up the capacity and secure the resilience of our health service. So over and above the consequential funding that has come as a result of the decisions around this crisis, we are also allocating money from within our own budget from things that, because of this crisis, we won't be able to spend the same amount of money on, into things that we do need to prioritise. So that is a process that is already underway and undoubtedly will continue. Libby Brooks from The Guardian.
Hello, First Minister. Going back to the economy, Gary Gillespie said that some of the factors in economic recovery would include consumer tastes having changed and business models having changed. And I just wanted to clarify, are you anticipating, for example, consumer spending habits changing, moving more online, spending less, and that having an impact on the speed of recovery? And also, what other countries are you looking at in terms of modelling for initial moves out of lockdown?
I'll ask Gary to take the point on the economy, and then I'm going to come to Gregor in terms of countries we're looking at in terms of what we might be able to learn on coming out of lockdown.
Okay, thanks very much, First Minister. I think it relates back to the question previous from Vivian on the type of recovery, whether it's greener, fairer, net zero type economy. What I was meaning in my remarks was essentially business practice has changed over this time period. Businesses are able to operate under different conditions. And when we come out of this, they will reflect on that. And some of those changes, like the changes we've seen across public services, they'll wish to remain. The point about consumer preferences and tastes, again, this period will have impacted people's behaviour, their priorities, and markets will take time to adjust to that. I think on a broader point, again, relating to the previous question, we've been engaging with other countries as well around how you build a sustainable net zero, or as the First Minister's previously described it, a kind of well-being type economy. And actually we have engagement next week with New Zealand, Iceland and other countries talking about how we ensure that's still embedded in the recovery. So in one sense we will emerge into a new norm for the economy, and many things will have changed. Many things will stay the same and there'll be differences. And we've probably seen an acceleration in trends and preferences given the impact of the lockdown.
Thanks, Gary. And briefly, Gregor, do you want to say a bit more?
You'll be aware that we've set up in Scotland a complementary structure to the scientific advisory structure that exists in the UK, and the CMO Scientific Advisory Group has been examining a number of different countries, not only across Europe, but actually internationally across the world, to try to get a sense of what the different approaches might be that could be important for Scotland as we start to think about how we exit the restrictions that we all currently experience just now. And there's probably a dozen or so different themes that are coming through fairly strongly from across these countries, and it's quite reassuring in some ways to see that countries are thinking very much along similar lines. What we need to be able to do now is use the data that we have in this country to be able to apply those different models to what is going to be the best for Scotland in terms of the way that we start to exit the restrictions that we've all experienced over the last number of weeks.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, today, David Ball from The Herald.
Thank you, First Minister. Going back to the rise in universal credit claimants, is there a concern at all that a chunk of that could be down to people having delays in receiving government grants, particularly those who have been self-employed? And have you had discussions with the DWP about ensuring those applications are processed promptly, given there's likely to be a backlog?
I don't know whether Gary's got any more insight into the breakdown of the figures. We can certainly look to see whether there's more we can find there. On the latter point, yes, we regularly talk to the DWP about the need to have prompt consideration of applications. We've been on record in the past before this crisis about our frustration, which is, I think, been shared more widely about the waiting times for universal credit. That said, we also recognise the enormous pressure that the DWP is under in dealing with this situation just now, which, as will be the case for Scottish Government systems, also has to be factored into the sense of realism we have about this. But obviously we want these applications to be processed as quickly as possible.
Nothing really much more to add to that, First Minister, other than to say that obviously the breadth of provision, there was gaps in that. We've identified self-employed people that had started businesses, and essentially what we know from the data, for instance, job seekers allowance, that a number of applicants weren't eligible. So in one sense, the provision, I think the rise in universal credit will reflect needs rather than miscategorisation, if I can say that. Okay.
Thank you all very much. Can I thank Gregor and Gary for joining me today. Thank all of the journalists. Thank again the signer who is helping us make these briefings as accessible as possible. And thank all of you for joining us. We'll be back here today at, tomorrow at the same time of 12:30. Later today I was going to say the Scottish Parliament sits. There'll be statements from the Economy Secretary, the Justice Secretary, and I will do a session of First Minister's questions at 4 o'clock. But we'll see you back here tomorrow.